Uh, Hello, welcome to the Socialist Legacy here on the Sublation Media Twitch stream channel. My name is Reed, and I'm here with my friend Clint, who is. What's your role in Sublation, Clint?
I'm sourcing creative content like you, and making sure that all of the plumbing is working,
Mhm.
and yeah, trying to bring as much of the left together to talk about possibility and the open necessity of socialism in the 21st century.
Great. So, you know, some people might be kind of coming to this for the first time. I have been producing videos and other content under the label Socialist Legacy for a few years, although have not been active with the project for a pretty long stretch of time. Um, but we are now kind of turning that around and beginning a kind of second wave of this project in collaboration with Sublation Media. So that's very exciting. We're going to be live streaming, I think, every Tuesday at this time, 5 to 7. Um, so you can tune in here on Twitch to find those streams, and the recordings will also be available subsequently on YouTube, on the Socialist Legacy YouTube channel, as well as on our podcast stream, or our podcast feed. So you can find all that. I also intend to produce new content of other kinds in the future, but I kind of want to get going. Um, with something a little easier to do, these kind of informal conversations, um, and then gradually ramp up from there if things get moving. So what we're gonna do today and probably for the foreseeable future on this stream is discuss a variety of different texts dealing with the history of the socialist movement and the legacy of socialism in the present. Um, Drawn from, in this case, and probably for the next few weeks, drawn from some research I've been doing in preparation for an article I'm writing, which I'm hoping will be published in Sublation Magazine. Which, if you are watching this and you don't know, Sublation Media has a new magazine on the web, sublationmag.com. I already have an article up there called Once More on Contradiction. So you can read that if you're interested. There's a lot of really great articles already on there. But I'm in the process of working on um, an article that is sort of a response to something that's now quite a bit old, actually, but still feels kind of recent to me, I guess. It feels in some ways like 2016 it still hasn't completely elapsed. In some ways, we haven't really come to terms with what's been happening since 2016. In 2016, obviously, there was the election of Donald Trump, but on the same day that Donald Trump was elected, election day in November 2016, Jacobin magazine released their, I suppose it was the winter 2016 issue. Uh, the issue was titled "The Party We Need," and that contained several articles, which are sort of interesting. As a kind of mission statement for Jacobin moving forward, following the Bernie Sanders campaign in particular, and in a sense, in the face of the Donald Trump, you know, presidential campaign as well as the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. But as that issue was just released on election day, it's hard to imagine that anyone at Jacobin, like anyone else out there, really believed that Donald Trump was going to become president, and hence that Jacobin's sort of project of giving intellectual leadership to the DSA and to the broader left um, would have to cope with the kind of unprecedented circumstances of a Donald Trump presidency. So the issue is in a sense, laying out Jacobin's game plan for leading DSA under a Hillary Clinton presidency. What exactly is the path forward, given the success, qualified success of the Bernie Sanders campaign, ultimately failure, but in some respects, people see it as a success of a kind. So what is the next step forward after Bernie? Where should DSA go? Of course, by that point, DSA had gotten something of a membership boost from the Sanders campaign. But the sort of massive explosion of membership numbers of DSA that really became like newsworthy and notable only occurred after the Trump election and could be seen as more of a reaction to Trump's election than enthusiasm for the democratic socialism of Bernie Sanders. In a sense, you could see DSA's membership growth after the election as reflecting discontented Democrats who would have voted for Bernie, perhaps who did vote for Bernie in the primary, maybe who thought Bernie would have won, is sort of a catchphrase of the sort of um, uh, DSA left in the Trump years. Bernie would have won, or in the 2020 election, Bernie beats Trump, and that sort of idea. The influx of membership into DSA could be seen as the expression of discontent among the Democratic parties, especially younger voters who wanted the party to move in a direction influenced by what Bernie's platform represented, and who were frustrated by what, in their minds, was, in a sense, a capitulation of the Democratic Party to Donald Trump and all the horrifying things he supposedly represented in their minds, by running a candidate in Hillary Clinton who, despite being, apparently next in line for the presidency in the minds of just about everybody in the country, even the people that hated her, um, who was, very widely disliked, and even among people that ended up voting for her, let alone people that, um, didn't. So all this is just kind of my way of introducing this renewed interest of mine in the perspective Jacobin put forward in that issue, because while in a sense they had to deal with a very different set of circumstances than they were expecting, you could say that um, what they were envisioning for the future of the left and for DSA in particular was sort of what they wanted to do, regardless of circumstances, and it, in a sense, was what they ended up doing, despite the fact that Trump was elected. So it wasn't exactly a turn in response to Trump, but it also represented a sort of um, it represented something that was in the cards already. In a sense, the explosion of membership maybe posed a bit of a liability to that plan. You could argue, in that they had all of these new members, maybe more paper members than actual active members, but in any case, they had a huge amount of new recruits, new money, new enthusiasm, press, attention, and whether or not they capitalized on that in the way they might have wanted to is, debatable. Whether or not the strategy they laid forward was the best approach under those circumstances is debatable, but it's what they did. Um, so I want to go into that whole kind of argument made in that issue. Specifically, the article, the kind of centerpiece article of that issue is an article by Seth Ackerman called "A Blueprint for a New Party." Um, there's also a really interesting and important and, I would say problematic, not all bad, but in certain respects problematic article on the history of the Socialist Party of America, by I think Paul Heidemann, um, which I also want to take a look at in the future, um, as a kind of diagnosis of the failure of the socialist party project in the United States in its original iteration. Um, but for today, in kind of preparation for looking at that whole set of issues, um, I wanted to turn back to Marx and Engels, and to the original kind of concept of the Socialist Party as they championed and as their followers um, followed through on up to at least the 1920s, and in some form, you could say, beyond that, although in perhaps degraded forms, to the point that by the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the last 2 decades, all that remains of those efforts were various kinds of sectarian organizations that had only pretenses at best to being or becoming political parties in any meaningful uh, way. Um, and now we're at a point where the entire concept of a political party for socialism and the Marxist kind of conception of the party has been really lost. And the whole issue of why such a party would be necessary has become deeply confused. That's sort of what interests me in Ackerman's article in particular, and in sort of the whole Jacobin perspective. It's laid out in other places as well. An issue from an article from a year later, published by Jacobin by Vivek Chibber, titled "Our Road to Power," is another kind of interesting articulation of this perspective. But in order to kind of set up the kind of discussion of what exactly is that perspective, where does it come from, where is it kind of losing a grip on what made socialism successful, up to a point in the past. Um, that's that I want to kind of set up that discussion by turning to Marx and Engels today, and in particular, looking at an article by an English Marxist, kind of a new left generation English Marxist, Monty Johnstone, called "Marx and Engels and the Concept of the Party." So we'll talk about that in a moment. But Clint, I don't know if you had any kind of thoughts on what I was just laying out there. So
Yeah, I guess so. Two thoughts come to mind. First of all, would you say that there was the aspiration by the millennial left to form an independent party at the beginning, or did this concept or did this notion of we need to form a party really come around with the Bernie campaign?
mhm.
And then, secondly, because I was just glancing at the Ackerman article, and he's talking about how we no longer live in that in the era of Jacksonian democracy, so to speak.
Mhm.
That the entire electoral system that we have is a result of the progressive era.
Right.
It's from 1870 roughly to 1920. And that's where, he's focusing on like how the entire electoral, like the down ballot line, the secret ballots, all of this is a result of the progressive era. So maybe to kind of like set things up, and as we turn to the Johnstone article,
Mhm.
maybe you kind of say briefly like, um, what was the aspiration of the millennial left to the degree that you saw it to be more than just progressive liberal?
Right. Well, it's something that I, as well as you, having being involved in the Platypus Affiliated Society, have followed for quite some time in quite a bit of detail. So it's something that I myself am a millennial leftist, as you are, of course. I wasn't really kind of in any centrally involved in anything. I was always sort of out on the in the countryside, watching from afar what was going on, so to speak. But nonetheless, there is a sort of generational intuition, you might say. But it's also backed up by this sort of intensive engagement with the millennial left over the entire course of its development, from its kind of beginnings with the anti-war movement of the early aughts, to what arguably, as Chris Catrone argues in his article, the millennial left is dead in the Platypus Review, it's death, which we are now living in the kind of aftermath of the death of the millennial left. Something that hasn't necessarily been fully grasped consciously by those it affects, millennial leftists themselves, as well as the younger generation that's now learning from the experience of the millennial left in whatever, um, you know, however beneficial or detrimental that education might turn out to be. So, there is a sense in which um, the entire aspiration to party building, with the exception of the sectarian groups, and we shouldn't leave them out, including groups that were relatively influential in, for example, the anti-war movement, like the ISO. There was always in those circles an attachment, however, sort of qualified and mediated, to the aspiration to build a political party for socialism, or at the very least, some kind of more toned down, version of that aspiration. A party of the left, a labor party, a third party, however it might have been articulated in whichever circles. But the sectarian left, the sectarian organizations were marginal even when they were more substantial than they are now, or still exist, even when they still existed. ISO obviously doesn't even exist anymore, save as sort of the remnants that float around in the DSA Jacobin milieu, and its publishing enterprise. So there was that aspiration in the background in some ways, and to some extent, the millennial left did get an education from these sectarian organizations, especially in the anti-war movement period. Um, but I would say that, like, on a broader level, kind of broader cultural level, so not necessarily on the left in the sense of a narrow segment of really politically, um, you know, attuned people, but people that maybe who generally vote Democrat and generally have sort of a left-ish political sensibility and might be won over to, a sort of socialist politics under the right circumstances. Um, I think there was a sort of evacuation of the whole uh, concept of the political party as something to aspire to and to build. Um, certainly in the academic left milieu, and in the broader culture. And that's something that goes back to really probably the 80s. There was coming out of the 60s already a kind of abdication of the possibility of building or rebuilding a socialist party. But there was also in the 70s this kind of explosion of sectarian efforts to capitalize on that possibility before the opportunity was completely lost. And that's where a lot of these sectarian organizations came from, or at least got a second, sort of birth, second lease on life. Um, so, there is definitely, um, there is already, before the millennial left comes of age, when we were just children, really, there is already this sort of forgetting of that whole dream of the party, that aspiration of the party. And in a kind of experience that preceded our generation's real political coming of age, but was kind of there in the background, um, was uh, the WTO anti-WTO movement, which had uh, a very clearly sort of anarchist character, and that reflected a more general kind of anarchist-ish, post-political, anti-political, post-left, um, kind of um, post-political leftism or post-leftism that predominated in that period. So coming into the world of left politics, our generation already had a kind of void there. There was already something sort of missing. And the renewed significance of certain Marxist sectarian groups in the anti war movement period maybe despite their own, you know, their own sort of failure to clarify the real nature of the politics they were prescribing to people. Um, they were sort of bringing that question of what about politics? What about political party back into the frame? Obviously it was sort of in the background. It wasn't really a prominent issue in the anti-war movement. It could have been. Maybe that would have led to a very different set of circumstances today. But the anti-war movement was not being directed, whether by ISO or any of these other sectarian groups, or sort of spontaneously on the ground in some sense. It wasn't being directed, the energy of that protest wasn't being directed towards party building. It was directed ultimately towards electing a Democrat to oust George W. Bush. And then, of course, Obama's election appears on the one hand as sort of the signal. In some people's eyes, you could see it as the signal of the first major victory of the millennial left, like the first election that they're voting in. They elected the guy that's ending the war, right? Supposedly. And not only that, but there was suddenly this financial crisis. And now we're electing the guy that's going to come in there and fix the broken and corrupt financial system that we were inherited from presumably 8 years of Republican leadership in the state. So there was a sense of a victory, but from another perspective, it's a very clear sign that we're on the wrong path and we're headed towards disaster. In a sense, the disaster already begins with the election of Obama, because um, any real clarity about what was potentially at stake in the anti-war movement was squandered in channeling that energy, the energy of that movement, into Obama's election.
And I,
Um,
and I think, yeah. So the question is, it's not the end of the millennial left that's interesting, but the beginning, right?
mhm.
Not the second half of the new left that's interesting, but
It's
the
the early period. Yep.
early period that's interesting.
It's really
So
a fait accompli by then, in a sense. And
so
then
in
of course Occupy,
right.
and then Bernie Sanders. But you go ahead, Clint.
So I was just going to say, so in that spirit, I was just looking at an article earlier today, and apparently the boomers have at least a good 10 years in them as like the ruling generation,
Hmm.
in terms of wealth, in terms of political power, in terms of like what it means to be like normal is to be like a boomer still. So who's going to be prepared, so to speak, in the next 10, 15 years, institutionally, organizationally, consciously, for that generational transfer at an actual level?
Hmm.
So in that spirit, perhaps we want to turn our eyes back to the 19th century.
Sure. Um, well, let me just say one thing real quick before we do that,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
by way of a transition, which is that obviously Occupy was kind of a swing back towards anarchism. But in the aftermath of Occupy, or by around 2014, 2015, there is a kind of renewed interest in the question of political party, and that has a number of sources. There was Syriza and Podemos. There was, enthusiasm around the ideas put out there by Mike McNair, and Bhaskar Sunkara of Jacobin played a role in kind of promulgating these ideas of a kind of neo-Kautskian, a return to the original social democratic conception of the party from the pre-war period, and so on. So there was, before Bernie even announced his candidacy, there was in the air, and in the Jacobin milieu in particular, this sort of question of, well, what about political party? But there's a sense in which the water was already tainted by that point. And, I'm not going to necessarily point to any particular source of that, but there was a clear sense of, or at least to me, it seemed clear that there is a kind of distortion in the thinking about what it would mean to have an independent political party, why that's necessary, what constitutes the independence of a socialist party, a party of the working class. So that's sort of where I see the potential of that moment as being sort of tainted. There is a sense in which what they're actually reaching for in this party turn is not a new party in the sense of like something different that we don't have, a socialist party, but rather a transformation of the party we already have, namely the Democratic Party. Because that, in a sense, you could say it reflects a dissatisfaction with what Obama turned out to be. Right? They wanted the hope and change of Obama, but they wanted to see the Democratic Party change in a way that Obama didn't actually represent. Um, so
And that if like we're not, and if they would, and if the idea was, well, okay, we actually do want like a dirty break, or we want, a separate party. The entire conception of the Socialist Party was just a Democratic Party in miniature,
right.
right? It was labor. It was like labor unions plus, race, gender, sexuality.
Or like a more kind of labor oriented version of the Green Party, right? Like the
Exactly.
left flank, aka the progressive, so to speak, progressive flank of the Democratic Party, you know, breaking off from the so-called moderate, centrist, corporatist, uh, you know, DNC leadership and kind of, mainstream. But what would that even really be? I mean, what you're really talking about there, splitting the Democratic Party, is forcing the Democratic Party to reconfigure itself such that it can overcome that split.
Right.
Because you're not going to be able to, you're not going to force the Democratic Party to, in a sense, completely um, dissolve the integrity of that relationship so that you have like the Democrats that really should be Republicans just becoming Republicans. The kind of corporate Democrats or what have you, however you think about it, warmongering Democrats. Although now, of course, the Republicans are the anti-war party, so who can figure this stuff anymore? Um, so there is a kind of desperation in that, a kind of lack of real political imagination if what you're really reaching for is a really marginal part of the Democratic Party. And it's marginal. Even today it's marginal despite the apparent successes of like the Squad and so on, these various progressive or socialist even legislatures, electoral victories. It's still a marginal phenomenon, and it's really more a matter of um, messaging than it is substantive policy, let alone politics in the sense of raising the question of who leads society and who controls the state by virtue of that leadership in society. So that's kind of getting at some of the issues in the Johnstone piece, some of the issues that concerned Marx and Engels. So
Yeah, I mean, like, AOC is just positioned to be the next Pelosi.
yeah. Yep. Okay. So, yep. So, so the Johnstone piece is, I think it's a really excellent synopsis of the piece. I should say is titled "The Concept of the Party in Marx and Engels," and you can find it on Marxist.org if you just Google it. I don't know if we can put a link somewhere that people can find, but
Yeah, it's there.
it's pretty easy to find. Great. It's a really unique uh, and it's one of these sort of unique gems of the new left moment. I think there are others, and it's not without certain liabilities, I guess. I'm not really familiar with Johnstone's work beyond this piece, and I can't really speak to his perspective more generally. But the merit of this piece is how it kind of very doggedly sticks to elucidating the perspective of Marx and Engels themselves, and not sort of editorializing on the basis of a sort of vague inspiration or a couple of cherry picked quotations that serve a certain agenda. So so Johnstone sort of opens the piece by noting the centrality of the concept of the political party, the working class party, the proletarian party for socialism to Marx and Engels. It's central to their thought and activity in the socialist movement. It's really, you can't avoid it unless you avoid their political writings altogether. And in a sense, it's impossible to avoid their political writings, because everything Marx and Engels did was in the service of their political goal, their revolutionary political project. Um, whatever distinction you might want to make between, for example, Das Kapital as a kind of scientific work of political economy or something like that. Um, it's true that there is no section in Das Kapital elaborating on the necessity of a proletarian political party. But it was written for a political party of the proletariat, at least in a certain sense, namely the First International. It was written for that audience, and of course, Marx and Engels. When Marx first conceived of the critique of political economy, that organization didn't exist, but there was nonetheless the hope and the expectation that the proletariat would constitute itself as an organized force in some form, such that this work could have a reception and clarify the stakes and the goal of the struggle that the proletariat was engaged in. Um, then, of course, the political writings, which are really more occasional, there's journalism, there's political pamphlets, there's correspondence, there's, official organizational proclamations, documents, the rules of the First International, the Communist Manifesto, etc. There isn't really a systematic exposition of their theory of politics, and hence there is no systematic exposition of the concept of the party and the role the party is meant to play. So that's kind of Johnstone's concern, is to clarify, so what exactly do they mean by political party? And part of his concern here is to clarify confusions that arise when people pick out particular passages, particular quotations, particular instances in the writings of Marx and Engels dealing with the political party, and using them to either elaborate a particular conception that, while drawing certain elements from Marx and Engels' perspective, is missing the bigger picture and hence distorting things by giving a kind of one-sided account of uh, what is actually being, what they actually are interested in, what they're actually um, trying to put forward. Or the kind of corresponding gesture would be to take these various one-sided perspectives and expose the contradictions between them, and expose how Marx and Engels don't actually have a coherent theory of a party. They actually talk about the party in various different senses that are incompatible with each other, and that just reflects um, you know the incoherence of their political project in general, or perhaps certain opportunistic moments on their part, or whatever. There's a lot of different ways in which this kind of account is exploited by both proponents and opponents of Marxism. So Johnstone's interested in sort of clarifying a lot of these issues by going back to Marx and Engels themselves. And he does so. There is a passage from another new left, or he's not really of the new left generation. He's sort of older generation, but he's in the new left milieu as sort of a mentor figure. Hal Draper, who is an American Trotskyist, third camp Trotskyist. And actually, I first encountered the Johnstone piece because Draper recommends it in another piece of his, as a good example of scholarship on Marx and Engels. Draper has a really amazing and powerful theoretical exposition of the political theory of Marx and Engels in what is ultimately a 5-volume work. He died before it was completed. but that kind of systematically goes through the perspectives of Marx and Engels on a whole host of questions relating to their political project. And his method in that work, that's called Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, is to follow what Lenin did in his State and Revolution. That's his method, is to just do the same thing that Lenin did in State and Revolution. And so I have a little quote here from Draper. I'll just read because I think it really gets at what is Johnstone actually doing here. Um, the method here is not to state certain opinions about what Marx really said and illustrate them with selected quotations, but rather to set about bringing together everything written on the subject by Marx and Engels to the best of the writer's knowledge. As against the various claims and interpretations, it proposes the simple expedient of setting it all down and trying to work out an answer that is at least consistent with the assembled evidence. So, in other words, trying to get as kind of integral an account of what Marx and Engels actually thought as possible. And that means looking at all these apparently contradictory formulations in the contexts in which they were written, the occasions for which they were written, and the broader kind of scope of their engagements in the real movement of their time, as well as their kind of intellectual and political development, and trying to make sense of it not through imposing some perspective upon what they're saying, but just trying to clarify what they were actually trying to say in their time, in their moment. So, and I think he does a pretty good job of doing that. So Johnstone sort of breaks down the treatment of the concept of the party in Marx and Engels into these various different models that they deal with over the course of their political career. But there's also underlying these various models a kind of general theory of the party, and that is operative in all of them, and that is certainly already in place at least by 1847. So by the time Marx and Engels join what was at the time the League of the Just, and are instrumental in it becoming the Communist League, and then composing the Communist Manifesto. Engels himself, I think Johnstone quotes Engels to the effect that it might have been Draper, to the effect that this conception was already in place by the beginning of Marx and Engels's collaboration. In other words, it's sort of foundational to what led them to undertake this joint work together that spanned the rest of their lives. So to go over this kind of basic theory of the party, at first needs to be recognized that the considerable variety and complexity and the apparent contradictions between the various formulations is because Marx and Engels didn't kind of devise this model of a party that they expected the working class to take up because they knew better and they had the right idea that had to be followed in order for the working class to be successful. Kind of basic to the conception of the party for Marx and Engels was the reality that the working class, the proletarian movement of their time, was already forming itself into a party. It was already a reality, a concrete reality for them. And that was specifically Chartism in England, the Chartist movement in England, which was seeking to expand the franchise to the working class, to win democratic reforms in the English electoral system, so that the workers could stand their own candidates in parliament and pursue their own agenda, which was increasingly influenced by the socialist visions of people like Robert Owen, Fourier, Saint-Simon, Wilhelm Weitling, others, of this sort of utopian socialist stripe. So at the time the Chartist movement was at its peak, it wasn't a socialist party per se, although there was an extremely prominent current of socialist influence within it. Of course, socialism meant a lot of different things at the time, but generally speaking, the socialist ideas were giving kind of substance to the political ambitions of the working class in pursuing their ability to stand candidates for parliament and to win representation in parliament. The substance of what they were pursuing politically was furnished by socialist ideas. And Marx and Engels, witnessing this, kind of, their perspective was essentially that as the struggle progresses and heightens and comes into more and more uh, kind of pronounced conflict with not only the capitalist enterprises that are employing the workers in as wage laborers, but also with the state, as this conflict develops, it will intensify the controversies within the movement and clarify the stakes of that are kind of being articulated through these socialist theories, these socialist ideas. In other words, what is it that the workers are really struggling for? Why is it that they feel the need to pursue political power themselves by forming their own political party rather than trying to influence the liberal elements of the existing parliament, of the middle class parliamentary representatives, because that was also occurrent in Chartism as well as in the broader working class movement of the time. Why not simply try to win higher wages, better working conditions, reduced hours through reforms taken up by sort of philanthropically minded parliamentarians, or for that matter, by pressuring representatives in various ways, legal or illegal, violent or peaceful, to take up these demands as legislative items. Yeah, go ahead, Clint.
I was just two brief things, and then because I want you to definitely bring that thought out.
Yep.
But but like at around the same time as Chartism, like literally the founding of the Democratic Party in the U.S., like the Jacksonian democracy, in like 60 urban manufacturer cities across the U.S. at the time, the workers are actually forming a separate political party. Like, there's already that incipient consciousness, and then what he would call like the class instinct, that is like already being expressed immediately with industrialization. So yeah, and so that problem of democracy is already being posed. But yeah, so proceed with the yeah, like why not just pressure the petty bourgeois, democracy.
Right. So Engels himself spent a considerable amount of time in Manchester in the 1840s, working for his father's factory there, and associating with the proletarians in Manchester, becoming conversant with both the Chartist currents and friendly with the Chartist currents, as well as with the socialist movement, which was at the time a movement of middle class intellectuals, essentially of people of a kind of more privileged background with more time to indulge in sort of intellectual activity, not as a profession per se, but as you might say a hobby or as a passion, who took to these utopian visionary ideas, especially in England of Robert Owen, that society was on the verge of a fundamental transformation, which was coincided with the development of large-scale industry, the Industrial Revolution. And the nature of this transformation was that whereas for all of human history prior, the form of social life was simply inherited from the past, and the present's role within its moment of life was to preserve the institutions that were handed down, and to in a sense find a way to live on the basis of what already existed. And that might require certain changes, but changes within that framework were always sort of reluctant and begrudging and only undertaken when really absolutely necessary, or otherwise they took place kind of behind the backs of the people involved, things might have changed in ways that they didn't really even realize they were changing. They might have even changed by virtue of the efforts to keep things the same. That's a point that probably deserves elaboration, but for the sake of time, we can skip it for now. Um, so the kind of recognition of Owen, and Owen himself is a really interesting figure, being sort of a prodigy of industrial capitalism. He went to Manchester as a young man when the Industrial Revolution was really just beginning to make substantial changes to the nature of commodity production in that city, and was able to rise in the ranks of the kind of management of the production process to the point of becoming an owner of his own factory and then a number of factories. And he kind of witnessed firsthand, not only witnessed, but was instrumental in the unfolding of the transformation of the labor process and the production process through the implementation of industrial machinery and large scale industrial production technique. And you could say that what he was kind of caught between two kind of countervailing recognitions. On the one hand, there was a recognition of this immense potential of humanity to transform the nature of its conditions of life consciously, not just, as had always happened before, kind of changing at a snail's pace, if at all, and trying not to change as much as possible, to this moment where fundamental changes were being consciously implemented on practically, a monthly basis, if not more frequently than that. And he himself was under, part of this process of implementing these radically transformative new, um, techniques, technologies, social relations within the milieu of factory production in Manchester. But on the other hand, his sort of good bourgeois liberal, sensibilities led him to revolt at the degradation of the conditions of the working class that was resulting from these changes, specifically from mass unemployment and the degraded conditions of both the unemployed workers and the employed workers as a result of the formation of this ever more kind of ominous mass of unemployed and in some cases unemployable would-be wage laborers, who were succumbing to disease, to crime, to alcoholism, and generally kind of weighing down the entire mass of wage laborers, both by hanging over the heads of those who were employed the threat of unemployment, thus making them ever more kind of submissive and willing to capitulate to the demands of their employers, lest they be cast into this kind of writhing mob of depravity. But also, in a kind of more general social and cultural manner, just the kind of stock from which workers could be drawn was being weighed down by this kind of increasingly barbaric condition to which the mass of proletarians was reduced. So he had this sort of visionary idea that if we can consciously transform society in the ways that we already have been doing through this industrial revolution, why shouldn't we do it in a way that benefits all of society? And hence, why shouldn't we, in a sense, reorganize society on the basis of a kind of rational plan such that all human beings are able to thrive and fully develop themselves rather than, in a sense, become ever more degraded, impoverished, and broken? So that was sort of the initial recognition. And there were other versions of this sort of socialist idea in the French socialist currents, but there was a kind of general, this was kind of the general notion that this fundamental change that was unfolding because it was not being fully reckoned with consciously, its consequences were manifesting in really negative ways. But there was the potential, by virtue of this change, to realize incredible positive, consequences that would, in a sense, deliver humanity to a condition that has never before existed, and that would fulfill all of the promises of all of the generations of the past with respect to what life could and should be. So that was sort of obviously inspiring for the workers who were sinking into this degradation themselves, at least to the extent that they were struggling to make sense of this situation, and not just make sense of it in an intellectual way, but in their effort to do something about it, to resist it, to change it, to overcome it. So that current was becoming more and more pronounced within Chartism, especially as the Chartist movement, as well as the trade union movement, which had a kind of complicated and often tense relationship with the Chartists, but was nonetheless there as kind of another aspect of the struggle. As this movement encountered more and more resistance and suppression from the state, as well as capitalist, capitalist enterprises. So there was this in kind of intensification among the working class of the idea that a fundamental change was necessary, and that in order to realize that change, um, the working class had to take political action, had to organize itself politically, and in so doing, take responsibility for the organization of society as a whole. In other words, not just on the one hand confronting the owners of, confronting the employers through trade unions and wresting concessions from them that way, and not just building these sort of cooperative enterprises that maybe embodied in some respects what they were ultimately striving for, but that were unable to make a meaningful impact in the sense of displacing the role of capitalist production in society. They were just sort of there as small, interesting, but ultimately inconsequential examples of how things could be different. There was this recognition that perhaps the reason the workers need to take political power as a class, independently of the bourgeoisie, independently of, which meant not only the capitalists, but really it meant the entire mass of people whose interests were coalesced around ultimately opposition to the struggle of the working class to take political power. So it's a kind of idea that develops as this opposition develops, and hence as the organization of the working class develops. So yeah, go ahead, Clint.
Yeah, so I wanted to pop in a question here from the chat around that incipient notion of the need for the working class to take political power, coming out of this utopian socialist moment itself. Spencer Leonard asks, can you talk about the way in which Marx and Engels' inherent internationalism, specifically their deep ties to engagement with both the Chartists and, say, the Blanquists, is relatively downplayed? So how is that precisely the global nature of this transformation and Marx and Engels' attentiveness to it that is allowing them to start moving beyond this merely utopian character of the initial stages of socialism?
Downplayed in where is it being downplayed in the Johnstone piece? Is that what he's?
I think in general left historiography.
Oh, okay.
Because he says this, it seems to me, negatively impacts both the dominant leftist histories of the revolution of 1848 and prevailing ignorance respecting the tasks and strategic conjuncture of the First International.
So that's core. So let me try to speed up my exposition here, because we're getting to the meat of the concept of the party for Marx and Engels, the kind of basic kind of fundamental theory of what the proletarian party is and needs to be, and that addresses this question. So Marx and Engels confront Chartism as it's sort of in crisis. It's unable to mount the campaign for democratic reform in a successful way, and it's sort of not clear what way forward the Chartist Party is going to take. This is in the early 1840s, up to leading up to 1848. Um, and Marx and Engels are in the socialist currents in England. They're Germans, but they're emigres. They're in sort of voluntary at that point, voluntary exile from their native country. Engels, of course, was already in England for other reasons. But they're in these circles of emigre radicals, socialists, communists, in France and Belgium and England. And they are interested in what's going on with Chartism and the trade unions and the cooperatives and all these other phenomena. And they're kind of looking at everything that's happening around them from the perspective of, well, what is the role of the socialist intellectuals in this process? So looking at it from the perspective of the English situation, the situation in England with the Chartist movement, England, of course, being where the industrial revolution has taken the firmest root and has most thoroughly transformed society, where there is the most developed proletarianized working class, as well as the most developed organized movement of the working class in the world. There is really nothing even comparable to it anywhere else at that point. So they are really looking at this example of England not simply as a national situation in England, but as reflecting a process of transformation that's already affecting the rest of Europe, and that they, as well as many other people of the time, are kind of understand is in one way or another going to transform the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, for that matter. Um, Only a matter of time and a question of in what particular ways that's going to manifest. But there's no question that the changes that have already transformed England are already working their way through um, other countries in Western Europe and other parts of the world, for that matter, but are inevitably going to lead to the same sort of fundamental changes that have led to the formation of a proletarianized working class and ultimately an organized movement of the proletariat, seeking not just to advance its economic interests through collective action, but to pursue political power as a class. Um, of course, or maybe of course is the wrong word, because this is a sort of an obscure point, but the whole reason that the Chartist movement, which wasn't initially simply a working class movement, it was initially a sort of movement of wage laborers, proletarianized workers, as well as petty bourgeois, this sort of middling elements, some of whom were kind of precipitated into the proletariat, some of whom would go on to become staunch opponents of the proletarian socialist movement. There was a split in Chartism, and that split, which I won't go in. Engels elaborates on this in the condition of the working class in England. That split led to essentially a distinction between a middle class Chartist movement and a working class Chartist movement. And the middle class Chartist movement kind of withered away. And the official Chartist movement took on a kind of increasingly conscious character as a sort of working class movement, a movement of the workers struggling for democratic reforms, and hence through those reforms for a challenge to the political power of the existing state. Um, there was a kind of understanding that the workers were struggling for these democratic reforms, and hence for by proxy for political power, for different reasons from the middle class reformers that they had formerly been cooperating with. And there was in a sense incompatible interests between these groups that led to the schism between them. So the question then is sort of, well, why was this split between these elements necessary? Why was the proletarianized wage laboring working class, why were their interests so starkly at odds with the middle class elements, who, of course, those were working people too. They may not have been wage laborers. They may have been artisans or professionals or what have you. They may have had a livelihood beyond being hired as help, you know. But ultimately, you know, they were workers too, and they did share certain interests with wage laborers as workers. But why did this split come about such that there was a kind of clear division between the proletarian movement for democratic reform and ultimately for political power and the broader petty bourgeois democratic movement, if you will? And getting to this question of internationalism, the Chartist movement understood that its struggle was not simply a national struggle as well. From rather early on, the Chartist movement was concerned with bringing the democratic revolution not only to England, but also to the continent. In other words, finishing the incomplete work of the French Revolution. That was kind of and for that matter, of the English Revolution and the American Revolution, finishing this incomplete work, not only in England, but across the continent. So the Chartist movement was instrumental in the formation of a organized democratic movement across the continent that brought together radical Democrats from all different European countries, and Marx and Engels themselves were instrumental in that. So there was a sense of, already at this point, of the international stakes and scope of the struggle. Now, what Marx and Engels are reflecting on in this moment is, so what is the role of the socialist intellectuals? Obviously, the earlier socialist intellectuals provided a kind of visionary inspiration in terms of helping flesh out the content of why the working class needs to struggle for political power, why it needs to organize for political power, and why it needs to organize itself independently of the other classes in society. In other words, what are its unique interests? Well, the socialist intellectuals helped clarify that the working class has an interest in a fundamental transformation of the entire nature of social life, not just the kind of institutions of society, but really the very substance of what society even is needs to change in a fundamental way. And it was precisely the proletarianized condition of the workers, their reduction to propertyless, propertyless condition, a condition that was fundamentally at odds with the entire conception of society that had been ushered in by the bourgeois revolutions over the preceding centuries, a conception that was an absolute absurdity from the perspective of the bourgeois revolutionary kind of worldview. This situation, this condition of the working class that they were kind of consciously grappling with and trying to make sense of, there was a sense in which this pointed towards the need for, not only the need for, but the possibility for a fundamental transformation of society. There was a sense in which the bourgeois revolution had hit a dead end that it couldn't go beyond within its own ambit. It needed to be overcome in a fundamental way that kind of went beyond the scope of what the bourgeois revolutions of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries had even sought to accomplish, let alone actually accomplished. So that was sort of being provided by the socialist intellectuals, the early utopian socialist intellectuals, that sort of recognition. But it was vague, and it was dogmatically articulated in these various different systems with very different conceptions of what the change that needed to happen would be, what the results would be, why those were the results envisioned, and so on. So it really only fueled controversy. It clarified as much as it kind of led to increasing cause for confusion and controversy as well. So for Marx and Engels, the role of socialist intellectuals that were conscious of this process, conscious of the historical task that was represented on the one hand by the ideas of the socialists, and on the other hand by the movement of the working class, they recognized that socialists that were conscious of this historical conjuncture needed to clarify that historical process from within and for the movement of the working class. that was in a sense what the socialist intellectuals were already doing, but they weren't doing it particularly well. Or in a sense, they did it well enough up to a point, but then at a certain point, utopian socialism, it only takes you so far. And the kind of contemporaries of Marx and Engels in the Communist League and otherwise, Proudhon, for example, represented a sort of regression because while on the one hand they sort of clung to the kind of same modus operandi of the utopian socialists, if in altered and perhaps in some ways more sophisticated forms, they nonetheless were still trying to do basically the same thing, which is prescribe for the working class movement and or for society in general in a kind of a way that evaded this kind of question of the class struggle, prescribing what society should become, how society should change, presenting a vision of what the necessary change was. And for Marx and Engels, that was sort of pointless. The real movement of history, the transformation of society, is not something that some, isolated thinker is going to cook up on their own, or even, a whole milieu of really intelligent intellectuals aren't going to cook it up. It's only going to come about by the immense majority of people in society, and hence increasingly the proletarian working class, undertaking this process of change themselves as a conscious act, a conscious process that they are actively responsible for, rather than kind of, causing to occur unintentionally, blindly, irresponsibly. So maybe I'll pause there for a moment if you have any thoughts, Clint.
Yeah. So, could you? This central point that that the emancipation of the working class can only be its own work. As
Yes.
simple as that sounds, it was actually a profound sort of breakthrough in the 1840s. So on the one hand, like you talked about within within Chartism, within like this like working class movement, the emergent labor movement itself. There's a break between middle class and more working class. And then on the other hand, we have. Could you speak then about like the League of the Just and how Marx then is able to like win the Communist League?
Yes.
And precisely on this notion of the real movement of history and the industrialization actually underway, which is like generating these utopian schemes in its initial explosion, but then is regress the attempt to then just like redo the French Revolution through Proudhonism and Blanquism is actually falling behind the utopians.
Right. So, well, let me, by way of answering your question, let me step back for a moment and look at the kind of broad scope of Johnstone's presentation. So I kind of just went a little bit into this kind of basic concept of the party that then gets elaborated in a variety of different ways in different contexts. The kind of core of that conception is what has subsequently been referred to as the merger formula, namely the kind of conjunction, the merging of the socialist movement, the movement of socialist middle class movement of socialist intellectuals, and the proletarian movement, the working class movement. The way Johnstone puts it, or one of the ways he puts it, is that theoretical consciousness and the spontaneous self-activity of the working class are the key elements, complementary factors in the Marxian conception of the evolution of the proletariat to full maturity and consciousness. So, in other words, the question is, the role of the party is essentially the question of how to clarify for the working class movement the stakes, the conditions, and the ultimate goal of its struggle. And in other words, to cultivate within the working class movement consciousness of what it's actually struggling for, why it's struggling, and what it will take to overcome this struggle, to get beyond this situation that it's struggling with. Um, so that's sort of the role of the party. The role of the party is to bring together the socialist intellectuals and the working class movement, economic as well as political, especially political. The political movement being seen as the result of the mature development of the more atomistic sort of struggles that take the shape of economic and other kinds of social struggles. Um, Although it's not necessarily, a kind of straight line from one to the other. Nonetheless, there is a sense in which it's only when the proletarian movement takes the form not simply of groups of workers in particular factories or localities or even nations, uniting for their common interests as a group, but when the workers seek to organize their entire class as a class, which means not only on a national scale, but internationally, because, of course, as was well understood at the time, the capitalist production process, like the economy of bourgeois society before the Industrial Revolution, was thoroughly international in character, and capitalism especially so. It was unavoidably international. Um, so there was, in a sense, it was in a sense already obvious that it had to be an international struggle. This was something that we can't really take for granted anymore as obvious, but it would have been sort of absurd to try to reduce this question to a national framework at the time. Nobody really thought of society as divided into these isolated nation states that were relatively hermetically sealed off from one another and had their own unique concerns. No, it was well understood that this is an international political and economic system in which everything is integrally related, and the struggles of the workers in one country are of a piece with the struggles of the workers in other countries. Um, Again, initially, in the bourgeois perspective, when we say worker in this sense, we're not necessarily talking about proletarianized workers. We're not talking about people that are condemned to wage labor for the rest of their lives, because, throughout the epoch of the bourgeois revolution before the 19th century, wage labor was seen, generally speaking, as at most a temporary condition that you pass through on your way to becoming, a proprietor yourself, capable of employing yourself, whether agriculturally or as a kind of skilled master of your craft. And if you were stuck in the condition of wage labor, it was, either, an unfortunate, but not generally, an unfortunate circumstance for you, but not like a general problem for society. Um, or for that matter, you could see it as nonetheless still emancipatory as compared to the conditions of being bound to the land as a peasant, or for that matter, a slave. Even the relatively meager and poor condition of a wage laborer is better because more free than being bound to the lordship of one or another, master. It was only with the rise of the capitalist production process, the Industrial Revolution, in which the nature of wage labor as a sort of rebirth of slavery, wage slavery, in which the capitalists did become masters to which the wage laborers were subordinate, not only temporarily, but for their entire lives, inescapably so. And that if they were lucky, in other words, lucky enough to become employed, let alone the kind of degradation and misery that awaited them if they could not become employed. This was a kind of fundamental change. But the internationalism of the working class movement precedes this situation. There is a kind of comradeship among the workers in the sense of bourgeois, individuals who work for a living, who live on the basis of their labor and collaborate in society with other people who do the same through commerce as well as through voluntary association of other forms. And, there is a sense in which all people in the entire world who are engaged in this life of labor have a common cause. And that is already there in the background when the internationalism of the proletarian socialist movement is raised as a kind of next level of the problem facing um, bourgeois freedom, so to speak.
Exactly. So maybe to like clarify the issue of the party that
Mhm.
Johnstone and Draper are both trying to like work through in their moment, right? So when Lenin is doing his book report on the state and revolution, and that's in terms of the capitulation of social democracy, right? Like how could Kautsky how could this Kautsky have done this, right? So what is the specific thing then that that Draper is responding to in his moment? What is,
Mhm.
as Spencer puts it, the inadequacy that Johnstone and Draper are intervening
Mhm.
in terms of the history of Marx's and Engels' participation in the left of their time?
That's
Through
a great, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great question. So, I mean, long story short, and this is something I want to deal with at much greater length in a future session, probably sooner rather than later. I want to engage with some of Draper's writings as well along the same lines. And I think the stakes are clearer for Draper. In Johnstone more treats this issue through a sort of almost academic discussion of Marxist theory. So he intervenes in various controversies over the interpretation of Marx that have almost a kind of academic cast to them. I mean, not that there weren't political stakes in these arguments, and not that the people making these arguments weren't politically engaged in one way or another, but it's sort of in the background. Draper is much more kind of clearly and forthrightly polemicizing against other people that are engaged politically in his moment. And there's a whole backstory in terms of Draper's political development and the role he plays in the New Left that is really needs to be delved into, but it kind of goes beyond the scope of this session. But to just kind of give an idea of where we would go with that discussion, the New Left is facing a circumstance in which, especially in the United States, I'm less familiar with the details of the English situation where Johnstone was working, so maybe I will restrict the claims I'm making in their details to the United States. But I think the broad swath of what I'm talking about applies more generally. Um, in the United States, in the 1960s, there had been a period of several decades in which there was no real meaningful form of socialist politics. So by the end of the 1940s, the most plausible contender for that role was the Communist Party USA, which by the end of the 1940s had completely bankrupted itself many times over. Again, that is a story for another day, exactly in what ways it did. But not only did it bankrupt itself through its own errors in judgment, it also, in the process, opened itself up to very intense repression from the state during the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, which, I mean, the Communist Party, there wasn't really much to speak of there as a meaningful political force by 1948 anyway. But what was left was basically disposed of rather easily um, during the 50s through various forms of repression. I think there's an apocryphal. I don't know if it's apocryphal or actual quotation, but I believe it's attributed that to J. Edgar Hoover that he said that the only reason the Communist Party still exists is because of the FBI informants on his payroll that are members of it. And if it weren't for the FBI infiltrators, there wouldn't be a Communist Party. So the Communist Party was sort of a dead dog at that point, by the 1950s, if not earlier, really already by by the late 30s, if not earlier than that. And the Socialist Party, while it did sort of come back from the dead when it was sort of almost completely liquidated by around 1920, 1921. And it was really remarkable that it managed to kind of come back, if in a altered form, nonetheless a somewhat, it was certainly nothing to sneeze at in its kind of rebirth through the late 20s and into the 30s, but it didn't really capture the same potential that the Party of Debs did, or that the European social democratic parties of the pre-World War One era did. Um, and it wasn't even really as impressive of a specimen as the Communist Party, at least from a kind of general public perception. The Communist Party was seen as like the serious revolutionary party, despite its actual political perspective. And the Socialist Party was seen as sort of more of a milquetoast reform party, although it did have a sizable militant faction, at least for a time, that was pushing it in, say, a more left-wing direction, if you will. But that was also basically spent by the 1950s for different reasons. The Trotskyist movement never really amounted to anything substantial, unfortunately. And what there was by the 1950s, likewise, was certainly nothing, even as, nothing, if you could say that there was something there in the 30s and 40s with the Trotskyist movement, it was there was really nothing like that left by the 50s, and that has its own history, the reasons for that, and that's an international matter as well. So by the 1950s, there is really nothing except these sort of fragments of what came before that barely exist at all. And there's a question hanging over the heads of young leftists that are becoming politically conscious in this period, namely in the 1950s and early 1960s. What about the Socialist Party? Not the Socialist Party of America, the organization per se, but what about the prospect of building a socialist party? Is that still on the agenda? Is that still something we should try to do? That needs to be done? How would we do it under these circumstances, considering that we're facing a set of circumstances completely unlike anything that the people that built the Second International, or for that matter, that built the various forms of the proletarian party that existed throughout the 19th century, Chartism, the First International, the Lassallean parties, the Independent Labour Party in Britain, and so on. None of the conditions under which those parties formed, those conditions are completely unlike the conditions facing the left in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, the Soviet Union and the Cold War being a big part of that, and the question that kind of raises that sort of deadly question of the relationship to the really existing socialist countries, and that proves a divisive and deadly issue for many currents of the socialist movement. But there's also this aftermath of the failure of the revolution that ultimately really existing socialism embodied, namely what the socialist parties of the earlier period were trying to do. They, in a sense, they succeeded up to a point, and then they failed at the critical moment. And the failure to, in a sense, lead the world revolution when the time was ripe was so devastating that it not only destroyed the socialist movement, beyond repair. Ultimately, there seemed to be the prospects for a revival in the 30s with, with the Comintern and the growth of the communist parties and so on. But that prospect was gone by the 50s. And hanging over the heads of the socialist movement was not only the question of the Soviet Union, But the question of, well, didn't we try to build socialist parties and learn that that is a failure, that that is not something that works, that that is not something worth trying? You could, of course, reply to that and say, well, they failed, but that doesn't mean they had to fail. That doesn't mean that would necessarily fail under other circumstances. Maybe there's positive things to learn from that example going forward, that a reforged socialist party could avoid making the same sorts of mistakes and succumbing to the same sort of problems that felled the old movement. And that was certainly a perspective that was, out there. But there was more generally this kind of skepticism and even cynicism regarding what it would even mean to build a socialist party. There was a sense in which that goal was foolish because that's already been done and we live with the results of it now. And not only that, but the results of it now in the form of the Soviet Union, but also in the form of the, sort of authoritarian state of the so-called liberal democratic West. That was on the one hand the welfare state. Of course, the welfare state itself having its origins in the counter-revolutionary response to the socialist movement in the revolutions of 1848. But there was also the question of, but there was also the intense repression of, Cold War era, again, so-called liberal statecraft. This sort of massive surveillance state, this massive constant war footing. I think William F. Buckley has this quotation, who's instrumental in the forming of the New Right, the sort of alliance of religious fundamentalists and libertarians and traditional conservatives and neoconservatives and so on in the 50s and 60s, the same period. He has a quote. He's not necessarily a kind of staunch libertarian himself, although he has certain classical liberal sentiments. But he is kind of appealing to the libertarian sentiments of his audience. And there is this sort of revulsion at the gargantuan character, this kind of monstrosity of the state that not only exists in the Soviet Union, but that exists in the United States as well. What is this monster state? Aren't we supposed to be opposed to that sort of thing? Isn't that the very reason that we oppose communism? Because communism invites that sort of monstrosity and even demands that sort of monstrosity. So Buckley has this characterization of, his pro-Cold War perspective, his anti-Soviet pro-Cold War perspective, and how that kind of seemingly conflicts with the libertarian sentiments by saying, perhaps it would take a totalitarianism on our own shores in order to defeat the totalitarianism abroad. So this whole kind of notion that the liberal democratic opposition to communism, Cold War liberalism, is motivated by an anti-totalitarianism is sort of absurd, because you'd have to be deluding yourself to think that there is anything, that there is anything liberal or democratic in a substantial sense about what the United States, what the state became in the, certainly by the period of the Cold War. And that process was already underway quite long before that. So anyway, that digression aside, back to the meat of your question. The task for the New Left is presumably, from a certain perspective at least, to rebuild the Socialist Party, to reforge a Socialist Party. And the question is how to do that. How could that be done? But that's coming up against this broader sense that it would be futile or even a major error to go down that road again, because the very thing that we're fighting against, both within our government, within our society and our government, but also to the extent that there's anti-Stalinist sentiments, the same thing that we want to see defeated in the Soviet Union itself, whether that takes the form of an anti-communist perspective or a kind of Trotskyist, anti-Stalinist, pro-communist perspective. There's a sense in which isn't the very thing we're fighting against the product of our efforts to build the party in the past and the failure of that party to do what we thought it was going to do? So that's really the dilemma of the New Left generation. And that plays out in many different ways in the various currents that are active on the left. And again, I'm not as familiar with the British left. But the New Left generation has this question it has to struggle with, which is, where do we stand with regards to the question of building a socialist party? And ultimately, the answer that was arrived at is kind of a non-answer, is we don't build the socialist party. That was sort of the state of that question by the end of the 60s, by say 1969, 1970. At precisely that moment, there's a crisis of the New Left. Again, a big question that we can't deal with in detail. There is a crisis of the New Left. There's the collapse of the SDS, for example, in the US. And there is, out of that crisis and out of this kind of general sense of the momentum of political possibilities that was building up and building to a kind of fevered pitch by the end of the 60s, was sort of losing steam and deflating and disappearing in front of their eyes. There was, by the early 1970s, this sort of response of a equally fevered attempt to build socialist parties. But that took the form of these various fragmented sectarian efforts that were at odds with each other, or to the extent that they were able to meld together into broader efforts. For example, one of the splinters of the Socialist Party of America was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which then merged with the New American Movement, another party building tendency, to form DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. To the extent that these efforts were able to kind of merge and form something bigger than bigger being sort of an exaggeration, I guess, but something more substantial than just these very narrow and embattled and bitter sectarian micro organizations. They kind of evacuated the substance of their politics in the process, which is what happens with DSA. So that's sort of the general problem. That's why this question is arising for people like Johnstone and Draper. There's this turn back to the party question after it's too late.
Right.
But also the way in which that question is being raised and the kind of conception of what it means to build a party, what a party is, what role it has, what constitutes its independence, is deeply distorted by generations of confusion and miseducation resulting from a failure to cope with and overcome these catastrophic defeats that led to the destruction of the old socialist movement.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that struck me about the Johnstone piece was really recovering, so to speak, Marx's liberalism. And also about how it's the working class movement itself, but without collapsing into the working class movement.
Right. This is crucial.
Yes. So perhaps we can let's come back to the 19th century then. And Spencer asks, can you bring it back to the originary circumstances for Marx and Engels, class struggle, the social question, Chartism, and the persistence of revolution, even after the unleashing of bourgeois revolution on a world historical scale? Yeah.
So Marx and Engels kind of develop this perspective in their moment. And just for a moment to return to the thread we were just on, this is sort of what Draper is trying to articulate at the end of his political career. So the early 70s, he kind of gives up on politics altogether, in the sense of sectarian organizations. And he devotes the rest of his life to writing this massive work that I described earlier. But before he does kind of throw in the towel, his last gesture last kind of hurrah, his last sort of you know, attempt to move his comrades in what at that point was the International Socialists, um, was an attempt to clarify what precisely the role of socialist intellectuals within the formation and development and coming to consciousness of the political organization, the political party of the working class was for Marx and Engels, and how that differed from this conception of the party that was current in that moment amongst all the various different sectarian splinters, including the one in which he was part and which he helped to form. Um, so I think in a future episode, maybe the next one, I'm not sure, but I want to go into depth on how Draper dealt with that question. But we can already see what he's getting at by looking at the example of Marx and Engels, because he's really just going back to Marx and Engels, and to Lenin for that matter. So for Marx and Engels, it comes down to this question of, so what role do the intellectuals play in the real movement? But that question begs another question, which is, what is the state of the real movement? Because of course, it's not as if there's just some sort of universal, set of, guidelines to follow under any given circumstances. The role that intellectuals are to play is going to differ depending on the actual conditions they're confronting, what they have to actually work with. The role of intellectuals in general is to help the working class movement come to consciousness of its task and the conditions of its struggle. But of course, its ability to come to consciousness of those conditions and that task depends on the state of that struggle, the state of their organization, the kind of level that it's at, and what the next step would be. In other words, for Marx and Engels, development of that consciousness was a matter of helping to guide that movement, not in the sense of telling the workers what to do, but in the sense of helping them understand what the consequences of the various courses of action they might take would be. Of course, it's up to the workers, their spontaneous self-activity, as Johnstone puts it. It's up to the workers themselves, their organizations, and their spontaneous activity to kind of find out what the consequences of their actions will be. It's up to them to decide what to do and to deal with the consequences of what they do. The point Marx and Engels have is that the communists don't confront this movement with a vision of what they need to do. It confronts them rather with consciousness of what the broad historical arc of the struggle that they're part of is, which will help them understand what the consequences of what they might decide to do will be, such that whether or not the workers succeed, if they succeed or if they fail, the guidance of the intellectuals, the socialist intellectuals, the communists in this case, will be reinforced. So, for example, the communists would have recommended, this is maybe anachronistic in a certain sense, but just bear with me. The communists might have recommended that the workers organize themselves independently of the other parties, the parties of the bourgeoisie, the middle class parties, organize themselves independently of those parties, and to only cooperate with those parties on a tactical basis, and only insofar as they don't sacrifice their ultimate goal of taking political power. I should mention here, just as an aside, because I meant to say it before, and this is something that Johnstone almost glosses over because it's, in a sense, so obvious that it goes without saying. But when we're talking about forming a political party, in the sense of struggling for political power, the goal is for that party to take power. The goal is, in this case, for the proletarian party to take power in the state. It's not to influence what the state is doing anyway. It's not to play the role of kind of a pressure group within the legislature or something like that, or for that matter, to become a junior partner of a coalition government or or even a senior partner collaborating with, these other parties. The point is for the working class movement in the form of its party to take power into its own hands, to conquer political power for itself, to become responsible for society as an organized force. That is something that's sort of, political party now just means, well, you put candidates up for elections. And what that has to do with political power is sort of, at best, an open question. Usually it's just sort of left off of the agenda altogether, that question. So back to what I was saying, say the communists are saying to the movement, within the movement, because they have the ear of the workers. These are people that have, that have big ideas and are well educated and have a sense of the world that we may not have, and we want to learn from them. That doesn't mean we're going to do what they say, but we want to take what they have to say into consideration. So if the communists are recommending you need to organize yourselves independently and not yoke yourselves to the organizations of, the political organizations of the capitalist class or the middle class, whether or not the workers actually do that, so long as they have that guidance in their mind, whatever happens, whether they follow that advice and it works, or they don't follow that advice and it leads to, defeats and failures and crises, it will confirm that the communists have a sense of the general trajectory of what needs to happen, and reinforce the legitimacy, the weight of their ideas in the movement. It will give more credence to those ideas in the movement. And for that matter, it will help educate the cadre of the working class movement, the people of the working class that constitute this movement, by taking active leading roles in its organization. It will educate them as to what the broad historical process they're part of is, and what trajectory it needs to follow in order to succeed. So Kautsky has this formulation in The Class Struggle that once the Socialist Party is formed through the union of the socialists and the working class movement, both the victories and the defeats of the movement become victories. And the defeats are, in a sense, even more valuable than the victories, because they teach the movement what not to do, and hence help lead it in the right direction. But without that guidance of saying, this is an error and this is why, that error might just simply get stuck in a holding pattern, or lead to demoralization and dissolution and the dissolution of the movement. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I feel like I might
No,
have lost the plot a little bit, but
no, totally. I think also importantly is it's by because you're talking about how the communists are, pointing out what the consequences of working class action will be, and also the mistakes and the errors made previously. And perhaps another way of kind of formulating this is that this theoretical consciousness that Johnstone is talking about. It's the eyes trained on the past in a way that is ahead of the curve.
Right.
So it's like, America is not about to like have another anti-slavery war. We never, that's been done. The czar isn't about to fall again. That's already happened. Industrial Germany's, that's so it's like the specific conjunctures that informed, the dialectical development of Marx and Engels themselves, and then of like the Second International. Like that's not going to just be repeated in a straightforward kind of way.
No.
And so the issue then is like how by having like the theoretical consciousness, so to speak, of history, of the past, is what's enabling this sort of higher socialist consciousness of raising the working class movement to the degree that it exists, to a sense of its higher task,
Yeah.
to the sense of the political necessity that it's going to be faced with whatsoever. Um,
It's a matter of bringing to bear in 1848, for example, it's a matter of bringing to bear on the movement as it exists at that moment. And that, for Marx and Engels in particular, meant Germany, which was in a much more primitive state with regards to the development of the working class movement compared to England or even France and Belgium. Um, they were not directly involved in France, or less so in France than in Germany, certainly. And in England, they weren't really directly involved at all at that point. They had maybe an indirect influence through their connections in the Chartist movement. But it was about bringing to bear, in 1848, it was about bringing to bear the lessons that were learned in the struggle of the Chartist movement that preceded that moment, so that the same mistakes that were made before are not made again. And so that um, the lessons of the past inform action in the present, such that um, the necessity that was expressed in the past through those failures is further clarified in going beyond those failures by learning from them. It's really a matter of learning from the past so that you don't repeat it, because the repetition is there. And it's not just the Chartist movement, it's also about learning the lessons of the French Revolution and the bourgeois revolutions more generally as well. Although keeping in mind that that lesson can only be brought to bear in a very qualified manner on the struggles of the proletarian movement because of a fundamental change in the historical conditions that's intervened since then. So then after 1848 and the period of 1848 to 1851, and ultimately with the formation of the First International, it's a matter of bringing to bear the lessons not only of the bourgeois revolutions and more importantly, in a sense, the lessons of the Chartist movement, but also the lessons of the failures of 1848, the failure of the French working class in the revolution to overcome the repression at the hands of the provisional government, the failure of the German democratic movement, which is to say the proletarian socialist currents within that movement, to overcome the cowardice and the sort of resignation of the bourgeois democratic movement to the ultimate victory of the reaction, and to overcome, for that matter, the collapse of the Chartist movement in the moment of this continental wave of revolutions, to overcome the failure of the Chartist movement to even mount anything like a meaningful challenge to Parliament. I mean, so I don't know. I feel like this is a lesser known. I mean, 1848 is obscure as it is, unfortunately, despite its importance for Marx and for the subsequent history of the socialist movement. But I feel like this is even lesser known than the kind of more famous examples of France and Germany. That 1848 was also sort of the last hurrah of Chartism. There was an effort to revive it in the 1850s. Marx and Engels were encouraging their some of their like Ernest Jones, a radical Chartist that was a comrade of theirs, to try to revive Chartism in the 1850s that didn't ultimately amount to anything. But in 1848, in April of 1848, so in the midst of this, after the French Revolution begins, this wave of revolution is cascading across the continent, and the Chartist movement um, mounts a gigantic demonstration before Parliament. So this is what they had done before. They had this series of democratic demands. They would mount demonstrations and through other tactics, essentially try to compel the parliamentarians to introduce and pass these democratic reforms. So in a sense, assembling the army at the gates of the parliament and saying, pass these reforms or we storm the we storm parliament and take over. That's kind of the implicit threat. That's certainly the aspiration of the radical elements of the Chartist movement. There's also more moderate elements, but even among the moderate elements, there is this kind of implicit sense that pass these reforms or something bad's going to happen, and we don't We may not want it to happen, but these people are going to go nuts if you don't do something, right? Um, so in 1848, in April of 1848, there's this massive, I believe it's the largest Chartist demonstration up to that point. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's the largest. It would certainly would make sense if it were, before Parliament. And anticipating this, given what's going on the continent, the government of England is prepared by calling in, essentially police to control the crowd, to read them the riot act and tell them peacefully disperse or we open fire. You know, disperse, get out of here. You're not making a revolution. That's not happening here. And that's what happened. They dispersed, and not only Chartism but really English socialism never recovered from that it's hard to even call it a defeat. It's kind of just a pathetic capitulation. But of course, the task would have been for that party to be organized and prepared to meet force with force if it came down to it, right? That would have been what was necessary. So these are the kinds of lessons that needed to be brought into the movement as it recovered and rebuilt itself in the aftermath of the victory of the counter-revolution in the 1850s. And again, the lessons of the First International needed to be brought into the newly forming social democratic parties that kind of emerged in its wake. And the lessons of those parties needed, as well as the Paris Commune and so on, needed to be brought into the international movement when it formed with the Second International in 1889. So you see the point here, right?
Yeah. I'm tempted to ask specifically what your thought on this is, because what exactly is occasioning the split within Chartism in the 1840s, between the middle class and the working class? And then how is that setting up this failure in 1848, or this like failure to even attempt, so to speak? Because then the First International will then later be more or less founded on the basis of the English trade unions. And so how is this like this I don't want to exactly call it a regression, but from the political horizon of Chartism to the strength of the trade unions. So like maybe if you could tie those three moments together, in the way that Marx is thinking about how it's reflecting the real movement of capital.
Right. So first of all, with the trade unions, there is, it's complicated, but the kind of general strokes of it is that the trade union movement and the Chartist movement were relatively separate. Obviously there was there was all kinds of overlap in terms of people, and sentiments and exchange of ideas and so on. But generally speaking, the trade unionists and the Chartists saw themselves as having a sort of different perspectives on what was necessary that maybe weren't fundamentally incompatible, but they saw each other as kind of going down the wrong road, right? So one group, on the one hand, it was political power through democratic reform that was necessary. On the other hand, it was the power of collective bargaining and the threat of the general strike that was necessary. So these were kinds of currents that were relatively, and there's so there's the cooperative movement and there's the middle class socialist movement, and there's all these different elements as well. The split in Chartism. So Chartism, you need to understand the democratic demands of the Chartist movement while being taken up by the working, the proletarian working class, and as well as, these kind of sort of middle class elements as well. It comes out of this kind of defeat of the movement for democratic reform that occurs in 1832 with the passage of the Reform Act. So there is a long-standing recognition of the necessity of some fundamental democratic reforms to the English Constitution, and that's another big story that we can kind of abbreviate here, but there's a lot to it. And also tied into this struggle for democratic reforms is questions of tariffs and international trade. The Anti-Corn Law League is another element of this. But with respect to the Reform Act, there is a Reform Act passed in 1832, but it doesn't do what seemingly needed to be done. It does certain things. It makes certain necessary reforms. But at the same time, it restricts the suffrage so that, with a property qualification, so that the wage laborers can't vote and they can't stand for office, right? So there's a kind of disenfranchisement of the working class. Engels describes this as the moment in which the bourgeoisie consolidates political power into its hands. So there's a sense in which this is a turning point, a fundamental turning point. Like, this is when the class struggle in the modern sense really begins in a way. So that whole description of the class struggle in the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the kind of opening salvo of that is this Reform Act. So it's not just the disenfranchised proletarians that are unhappy about this. It's also, so to speak, the lower stratum of the middle classes, as well as the kind of democratic, radical Democrats, idealistic radical Democrats that recognize this as a sort of inadequate and even, as a kind of betrayal of the cause of that they've been fighting for, and that standing in the tradition of the English Revolution and the American and French revolutions, for that matter, they sought to advance. So the Chartist movement emerges out of this attempt to redress the wrongs of the Reform Act of 1832. It also develops out of the socialist movement as well. There's a lot of Owenites that are part instrumental to the formation of, I think an Owenite socialist intellectual actually wrote the charter, the demands of the Chartist movement. But so there is a sense that this isn't like a class issue per se, even though it does affect the working class, the wage laborers in particular, in a fundamental way. It's an assault on democracy. It's not an assault only on the working class. It is an assault on the working class, but it's an affront to democracy more generally, and to the democratic representation of the petty bourgeois elements and so on. And the integrity of the Constitution, the integrity of the revolution, for that matter. So the split is complicated. The account Engels gives of it in the condition of the working class in England really should be read. I think that's another neglected work that really needs to be read, especially the chapter on labor movements is the title of the chapter. That's where he elaborates on this. There's a number of issues involved in this split. It comes to a head with the economic crisis of, I think, 1837. But it really, there are a couple of major issues. One of the issues is the question of physical force. So there's the, I think it's called the physical force Chartists and the moral force Chartists. So there's this split over whether the movement should take up arms. And there's a number of questions about what is actually involved in that proposal, right? So it's not necessarily a matter of like rioting and wanton destruction and violence. It's more fundamentally a question of self-defense, as the 1848 example kind of shows. But there are sort of riotous, unruly elements, and a lot of these demonstrations do tend to break down into rioting. And there are some that champion that, but I think that's more of a marginal current. I don't think it's the physical force Chartists, by and large, we're not advocating like just running around inflicting wanton damage on property and person, or something, as if that would somehow help their cause, right? Although that's certainly how they were framed by their opposition, both within the Chartist movement and in society more generally. It was probably more a question of police, kind of agent provocateurs. I know we're running out of time, so let me wrap up real quickly. The moral force Chartists, namely, opposing the use of physical force. The other question was the question of so-called the social content, the social question. So in other words, kind of socialist demands. So in other words, why are we fighting for democratic reforms? Why are we trying to take power? To introduce social reforms, not just democratic reforms, but social reforms that will redress the social question. In other words, the deteriorating condition of the working class, and especially of mass unemployment. So those were seen as despotic inroads on the right of the private property of the capitalists, and they were opposed in that, on those grounds as kind of anti-bourgeois, so to speak, as sort of counter-revolutionary, you might even think, regressive, reactionary demands, a kind of regression to a pre-bourgeois, pre-revolutionary state in which private property wasn't respected, in which the state could claim the private property of individuals for itself in the name of the public good. So that was sort of a major element of the split as well.
So it's the physical force and in the foregrounding of the social question.
And of course, in both cases, it was the proletarian side of the movement that tended to flock towards those elements, in both cases for understandable reasons. They have a much harder set of circumstances in life. They're much more readily acquainted with having to defend themselves, with confronting violence in society. They don't come from respectable society, and they are dealing with these so to speak bread and butter issues in a way that the middle class elements may also be struggling with poverty, but their escape from poverty is property. It's to acquire property for themselves so that they can employ themselves. That's sort of what they want. And so if the proletarian side of the movement is demanding, so to speak, despotic inroads on the right of private property, that's fundamentally at odds with their interests. So.
And this might be, so we can feel free to go over. This might be a little bit of too big of a question, but it kind of ties back to the article that you wrote for Sublation about how already by the 1830s, so to speak, with
lower the blinds. Keep going. Keep going. I can hear you.
Yeah, but and I'm also just seeing if the when the next crew is ready. But ready just in a second. But already by the 1830s, you have this parallel phenomenon where political economy is now becoming just simply apologetic. So it's like, with the, so to speak, with the passing of Ricardo and Hegel, so political economy is becoming apologetic, and so to speak, the young Hegelians are being, or the generation after Hegel is being, let's just say, industrialized, it's being proletarianized. Right. That it's already starting to, the dialectic is, the end of history is becoming problematic, is falling apart. So maybe as like a sort of, if you wanted to just sort of tie how like that specific split within Chartism is responding to this vulgarization of political economy, that is how like this is how the working class, this is how those who labor, this is how like bourgeois society, so to speak, is actually taking up its own crisis within the labor movement.
Right.
Yeah.
So as I say in that piece, in the 1820s and into the 1830s, there is this kind of explosion in the world of political economy of a new tendency that is subsequently referred to as Ricardian socialism, which some will quibble that these people that are raising these questions, writing these pamphlets, they're not like adherents of Ricardo's theory, so to speak. They're not like following Ricardo. They're really more followers of Adam Smith. In a sense, they have more of an Adam Smith perspective, which Smith did not confront this, the conditions of the Industrial Revolution. He was only kind of at best dealing with the very earliest tendencies in that direction, and wasn't really cognizant of where they would go. Although, he has, there's inclinations, I guess, or intimations, I guess. But these so-called Ricardian socialists are essentially, so Ricardo's big fundamental innovation, which makes him the last great scientific political economist, is his recognition of the crisis of bourgeois society in the fundamental and irreconcilable opposition of the interests of the owners of capital and the wage laborers. Now, that is the way Ricardo deals with that. He's not, he still has sort of a Smithian hope for reconciliation in some sense, and he really scapegoats the landowning class. So it's more for him an issue of fully prosecuting the bourgeois revolution to completion. So those landowners need to be fully bourgeoisified or else expropriated. I don't know if Ricardo would put it that way, but that's sort of the spirit of the perspective. So the Ricardian socialists also recognize this antagonism, but they recognize it as a task for the working class to confront and ultimately, so in other words, if Ricardo is looking at it from the perspective of bourgeois society as an ideal, as sort of something to be maintained in its integrity in the face of this crisis, the Ricardian socialists are raising the question of, well, what about the struggle of the workers? What does that mean? Like, what are the consequences of that struggle? They ultimately generally have a sort of narrow horizon of trying to reestablish the sort of Smithian vision of a society of cooperative labor as coordinated through commerce. And the kind of echoes of this perspective, Proudhon essentially takes up this perspective, but in a kind of degraded and vulgarized form about a decade later. So that's where that goes. And Marx really likes the Ricardian socialists. I mean, for what they are. I mean, he recognizes their limitations, but he recognizes in what they represent as this attempt of the working class movement to clarify for itself the stakes of its struggle. That's not to say that these political economists are themselves proletarian. They're not. They're middle class intellectuals. They're mostly actually members of the socialist movement. They're mostly Owenites or some other variation, or at least sympathetic or curious about those tendencies. But it's in the sense that the working class movement takes up these ideas and tries to understand its conditions and the nature and tasks it faces in its struggle through these writings, right? So these writings become very popular in the trade union movement, the cooperative movement, and the Chartist movement, and they help clarify that struggle. So Marx, in taking up the critique of political economy, which he sees the Ricardian socialists as having inaugurated, but not really brought through to its conclusion, only kind of they only kind of pointed in a direction that they weren't able to follow through on due to sort of the primitive state of both the class struggle at that moment, and of their own perspective as sort of middle class intellectuals that are isolated from the real movement, which is isolated in the sense that the movement hadn't really developed into a meaningful independent form at that point. So Marx seeks to essentially finish the job that the Ricardian socialists started, follow through on it, and in that sense, fully clarify the conditions and trajectory and ultimate tasks facing this struggle. Namely, why did bourgeois society come into crisis with the Industrial Revolution? And what is the potential of that crisis for a transformation beyond the kind of beyond bourgeois social relations, beyond labor as the fundamental kind of relation through which through which society is organized. So that's the task of the critique of political economy. That's what it's about. That's why he does it. That's why he thinks it's so important. That's why he and Engels and Kautsky and Lenin and every other Marxist regard the critique of political economy as a monumental accomplishment and a fundamental kind of decisive contribution to the proletarian movement. It's not just as like a neutral economic theory or something like that, or sociological theory. It's as the self-clarification for the working class, the means of their self-clarification of the conditions and general aims of the struggle in which they're engaged, such that they can use what they learn through this work to follow through on their struggle and overcome the crisis that the struggle is both responding to, and that the struggle will ultimately engender within itself. So
Yeah, it's because it raises the question of why did political economy need to be critiqued in the first place?
right.
You know,
Right.
what rose the demand for that at all?
It's a big question, so for
Well,
another episode, I suppose.
no, but we're gonna be threading that through.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Reed. And we'll be back on here next week.
Awesome.
Everybody who's watching, stay on, and in the next 2 minutes, we're going to be moving on to our next program, self defense, intellectual self defense, with our cast of characters. We'll be talking about the several takes from the left on cryptocurrency and the politics of money in the post neoliberal era. So thank you, Reed, and everybody. We'll be back on next week.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you for having me.
Yep.